fire Morse code. But nevertheless, the amplitude will be there, and you should be able to pick it up if you're in the target area of those waves.
What would happen to the ozone layer if it got bombarded as well?
Well, actually, one of the claims of the project is that it would rebuild the ozone layer, that if they used it just right, it would create that O3 ion, which is the actual complex for ozone, by charging up those oxygen atoms and allowing them to come together as that very reactive O3 molecule that reacts with the UV as it comes into the atmosphere. The risk is that if a solar tap occurs, all that potential is discharged. So the ozone layer would actually be completely destroyed, and it would take probably 25 years for it to rebuild through natural means.
Huh. That could be damaging.
Well, yes. Then if we had a particularly strong solar activity, lots of protons hitting the planet, lots of UV, some coronal mass ejections or solar flares, there's nothing to stop it from reaching the surface. It would literally sterilize the surface of the planet. We'd be like Mars, but for a short period of time. And believe me, if you kill off the bacteria, you begin to kill off man, because you're beginning at the very basic levels of the food chain, and you're dimerizing. That is to say, you're splitting apart genetic material and not allowing it to reproduce.
If some people just don't feel right, they feel weird, strange, is it possible that they're picking up something from HAARP?
Yeah, it is possible, and this will be more widespread. You can pick this up by looking at police reports of anxiety, of people not sleeping for days at a time, and crime going up, especially domestic crime, because you become tense and irritable and sleepless, and you have nightmares. And sometimes patients, especially under Nick Begich's observations, can even hear voices. They can hear messages like God speaking to them. And I can tell you that if the government's doing these kinds of experiments, they would put these messages into there. And when it was used in the early 90s in the first Gulf War, it was crude, but it was effective in upsetting the ability of the soldiers to stand and fight. And these were trained, battle-hardened troops. They came out of those bunkers like kids.
Brooks, it's hard to believe, but it's also believable, isn't it?
Well, it is, and I'm like I said, I'm not too much into believing conspiracy theories, but when I see the capabilities for myself and the scientific risks myself, and then I look at the historical track record of our own government, I think to myself, what government in their right mind would drop a thermonuclear device on a city with civilians in it? Well, there's the answer.
What's your website?
The best website to get everything would be xsquaredradio.com. That's kind of my Sunday night treatise where I speak to the people about what I'm doing. But then there's visionmotorcars.com if they're interested in the electric vehicles, and of course rememberingthefuturebook.com for my latest book on resonance theory and self-help.
All right, Brooks, when we come back, I want to talk with you about the History Channel appearance that you made about a year ago, as you talked about HAARP as well. We'll get into that later on tonight. We'll take your phone calls with Brooks Agnew right here on Coast to Coast AM. Next hour, we'll take your phone calls with Dr. Brooks Agnew as we talk about his trek to the journey to the center of the earth and also HAARP and other technologies. That'll be next hour on Coast to Coast AM. And when we come right back, I've still got more to talk with him about. So we'll be right back. Don't touch that radio dial. Brooks, tell us about the History Channel show that you did on weather warfare, and what were they looking for? Because you demonstrated some things, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. Actually, the producer was really, really great for the History Channel. They wanted to see if we could build a scale model and actually demonstrate for a viewer what it looks like to move a cloud or what it looks like to make HAARP work. I, of course, had done almost 8 years of field work with what's now known as HARP technology. In those days, we called it ground probing radar, because we used it to look for oil and gas in the ground, and it was, very successful in doing that.
Sure.
And the challenge was to build something that was both visual and functional and safe. So we ended up building a pretty large acrylic cloud chamber, and we used an ultrasonic nebulizer to actually make the cloud. So we didn't use steam. We actually used cold vapor using a high-frequency vibrator to push little micro droplets into the air. That's how clouds are really made. And once we got the cloud made in the chamber and it was nice and stable, I had the HARP scale model phased array in the bottom. And I think we used between 8 and 30 hertz laced onto the frequency. We shined some lasers through the clouds so that you could actually see the turbulence occurring inside. They zoomed in on it with high-speed film. We turned it on, and within 5 seconds, that cloud was gone. And when we slowed the film down, it was really dramatic. So when that episode aired, that really put the government on notice that people now know that HARP can move clouds, and millions of people saw it on television.
And you also demonstrated it for Jesse Ventura, didn't you?
Yeah, some of their team, June Sarpong, was a great interviewer that was working on the team with conspiracy theory, and it was in Burbank. So I took the equipment over to their studio, set it back up, and did it again, repeated it again for their cameras. And it was nice to see that it was repeatable. That's always great when you set up an experiment and it works twice instead of just in one area in Santa Monica. But it was also a very highly viewed program. I think it was much more popular because of the star power of Jesse Ventura and his great persona. Mm-hmm. And he's kind of a natural, government buster anyway. And this was a subject that when it fell into the subject box, they decided to make it the debut episode, and it just happened to be the most watched episode of Conspiracy Theories. And the interview team did a great job. The experiment worked really well, and it was a super visual effect the way we backlighted it. And people got to see, practically how HARP works. Instead of reading about it on the Internet, they could actually see it work for themselves.
I would assume that Jesse probably didn't even know what HARP was until this program, or until the researchers and you and Begich showed up on the scene. Do you think he's a believer now?
Yeah, I think he's a believer. He did something that I haven't done. I'm sure Nick or his people, his group in Alaska have done. He went there. He went to the gates and tried to gain access, and he tried to use his ability as a former governor and a very public person and being on camera. And when a guy almost as big as he was came out to the gate and said, "Jesse, you're not coming in," and that was a very tense moment.
Well, yeah, it sure was. And back he went, but he wasn't too happy about it, was he?
No, he wasn't.
You have talked about a lavender haze that seems to be over certain earthquake spots. But you also talk about it in terms of HARP, so explain that.
Well, this is where HARP kind of gets its primary name, the high-frequency active auroral, because when they fire this thing off, it has so much power, it dumps up into the ionosphere, that the ions up there have no choice but to start dumping that energy. And they do it by the electrons jumping up to higher energy states and then dropping down to low energy states. And when they do, they give off a photon of light. That light is what we see as auroras. Typically, it's done by a combination of solar wind and energy and earth magnetism. And so we see it in the northern climes and southern climes. Well, we wouldn't see it in the equator because that's where the magnetism of Earth is most concentrated. And there's kind of a magnetic electrode jet from the Earth that goes up and spreads out over the magnetosphere of the Earth, which contributes to that ionization effect as well. But the HARP is an artificial version of that. It pumps a very finely tuned frequency up into that ionosphere. And so thus it is artificial. It is shall I say, more stimulative in a targeted way to the ionosphere than, say, would be solar wind or even galactic frequencies that are now coming into our solar system. We also, when we see HAARP fired off, it's aimed using charges on the phased array further south. And so when we see a lavender haze over Haiti before the quake, over Chile before their big quake, we get very suspicious because auroras don't appear in these southern climes. We know it's artificial. We also know that the wavelength of light is more toward the purple band, which means it's a much shorter wavelength, much higher frequency than the greens or yellows or even reds that you would see in the northern climes, which are much longer wavelengths, more typical with solar radiation. And that's why we see these fingerprints hours, sometimes minutes before these quakes occur.
What would the motivation be, Brooks, to fire that machinery up and create an earthquake?
Well, that's a good question. Economic, sometimes experimental. When you follow the money, you get a much clearer explanation of what's going on. We know that the United States foreign policies have not made us very popular in different areas of the world. It's not that we're bad guys. We're a great people, and we're trying to do great things for the planet. But there are certain aspects of our government down at what I call the Department of Wars R Us that are constantly keeping things in turmoil and more pushing toward what they call the interests of the United States, which is a more imperial viewpoint than, say, what states or even citizens of the United States would take.
The creation of these earthquakes, which, they've occurred. Now, the question is, was it natural or was it forced by man for whatever reason? Massive deaths, lots of damage. Could it be used as a political tool as well to simply say, look at what we can do anytime, any place?
Well, fortunately, that kind of cablegram has never been leaked. If that one ever gets leaked, then your suspicions are well-founded. But that being said, if the weapon system is capable and it's been demonstrated in an area that's, maybe off to the side politically, then you go to the leadership and you say the darn thing works. And we know from history, from Harry Truman getting that exact same message from the Manhattan Project crew, it works. He couldn't get that bomb dropped fast enough. And it ended up changing the course of humanity.
Can they manipulate a hurricane with HAARP?
Well, I don't know that they could take over the energy system of a hurricane once it started, but moving the stratosphere around by pushing the ionosphere out ahead of the hurricane, ahead of the path of the hurricane, makes the jet stream move in that direction. I would say that they could not resist the temptation to steer a hurricane where they wanted it to go.
What can we do to try to make this safer for people?
Well, that's really the greatest question that Nick and I have been trying to answer for 14 years, and that is we need civilian oversight. We need scientists and the engineers that have experience with this in the field, both politically and from an engineering standpoint, to offer oversight or offer some kind of contribution to it so that they're aware of the risks, they're aware of the people's concerns for these risks, and maybe be more wise before they push the green button.
Maybe. What do you think they're still doing with HAARP? Are they perfecting it? Can they get it even better?
Yeah, they are perfecting it, and they are pouring more money into it. And the website is getting even less informative. Years ago, they used to have lots of photographs and articles and even experiments that they were running and measurements that they were taking. You don't get any of that now. Now it's more of a tourist site, and a couple of times a year